I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Putin hosts world leaders in Moscow for his Victory Day parade, we break down what was really on display, both in military hardware and political messaging. How much of the spectacle honoured World War II, and how much signalled the rise of a militarised Russia. Then we speak with a former Ukrainian MP and leader of the Sky Shield Initiative about proposals for Kyiv's allies to shoot down enemy missiles, and report on the latest resistance efforts in the occupied territories.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 9th of May, 3 years and 75 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, former member of the Ukrainian Parliament, Lesia Orobets, friend of the podcast, Oksana Pyzik of University College London, and later, researcher Illia Riepin. But first, over to Dom for his analysis of Putin's Victory Day parade.
Let's start in Red Square in Moscow. So Oksana and I were live commenting on the events of the Victory Day commemorations this morning. So Victory Day commemorating the end of the Second World War. Well, it's Russia's commemorations for the end of the Second World War. You'll find the live footage of that and our commentary on YouTube. Anyway, we'll talk about the details in a moment, but the sort of headlines: Putin said that the Soviet Union had determined the outcome of the Second World War, at odds with what Donald Trump was saying earlier in the week. It was like he was joined at the hip with Xi Jinping, Chinese president, of course. There were many other world leaders present. There were military contingents from China, interestingly, Egypt, Vietnam, a lot of the stands, Laos, Mongolia and Myanmar. There were no North Korean troops on parade, but there was a military delegation of North Korean senior military leaders. They were seated prominently in the front row of the parade's viewing stand. There were lots of hugs and handshakes later from Putin. There'd been a huge amount of effort put into drawing parallels between this memory and commemoration of the Second World War and obviously today's war in Ukraine. Putin said Russia has been and will remain an unbreakable barrier to Nazism, Russophobia and anti-Semitism. Truth and justice are on our side. The entire country, our society, our people supports the participants of the special military operation, whether they like it or not, I think, Francis. He said, we are proud of their courage and determination, of the strength of spirit that has always led us to victory. So it was very much rooted in the present, and occasionally he might dip into the past and reference a veteran or two to try and give it that veneer of respectability. But it was clearly the whole thing very stage managed about the Russia he wants of today and where he wants to go in the future. So just as a very brief bit of background. So what is Victory Day parade for Russia? The first one held in June 1945. So whilst fighting was still going on in the Far East, but yeah, the war in Europe was over. The first parade in June 45 saw 40,000 troops and nearly 2,000 vehicles. Now, there had been parades before to mark the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. So on November the 7th each year since 1917, there had been various parades. It was an opportunity to show off Soviet military hardware. But Victory Day was so named and started after the Second World War. However, it wasn't a regular thing. There's only been three. There were only three between 45 and 95. There's one in 1965 to mark the 20 years, and then one in 85 and 90. So it came back into vogue and was really pushed since 2008 by Putin, really sort of using it to burnish his own credentials and, as he saw it, the Russia that he wanted to build as well. There were moments of rapprochement with the West. So US President George W. Bush attended the 60th anniversary in 2005. And then in 2010, get this, Francis, imagine this now. In 2010, NATO troops, including from Britain, America and France, took part in the parade. Such gestures have long vanished. Now, since the full-scale invasion, so in 23 and 24, the parade was nothing like in the past. There was only one tank. It's always led by a T-34, so the workhorse of the Second World War, especially towards the end of the Soviet Union. So there's always a T-34 on parade, and that was the only tank. That was the only tank in 23 and 24, which was, not just my interpretation. It was a humiliation for Putin and Russia to only have one tank on parade, and only about 9,000 troops in the last couple of years. So last year they had 60 military vehicles, but many of these were new armoured cars and this sort of stuff, 4x4s and so on. No tanks again. And last year only 9 foreign leaders. So they really pushed the boat out this year. They needed a better show. So the numbers might belie actually what was going on, but we'll talk about that in a moment. So ahead of the parade, what was I looking out for? Well, we know that the airspace around Moscow and many of the Russian regions was closed for 3 of the previous 4 nights ahead of the parade by Ukrainian drone strikes. So there was always a suggestion that Ukraine might try and disrupt the parade or attack the parade. I think that was a little bit fanciful. I don't think Ukraine would take the risk of killing Xi Jinping and other world leaders, but particularly Xi Jinping. So I didn't think there was going to be an attack on the parade. But who knew? Nobody knew, and certainly not the Kremlin. Hence, I was looking out for air defence units, anti-drone stuff, snipers around Moscow and in Red Square in particular. Now, they weren't much in evidence, but I have seen images posted on social media subsequent to the parade that show snipers, as we thought they would be, among all the lights and the cameras up on the rooftops. Also, we know that huge parts of Russia, particularly in the West, were subjected to a mobile internet blackout. And who else were there? I was looking out for Western influencers, obviously, to give it this veneer of respectability. If they are influencers still, they're not influencing me. But we saw American actor and Hollywood veteran Steven Seagal, a long-time Russian stooge, and American director Oliver Stone. Oliver Stone, known to have strong sympathies for Russia. So they were there. Most controversially, and one that we'll speak about later, Slovakian Prime Minister Robert Fico was there, the only member of the EU to be there and to lay a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier. But more on him shortly. So what do we see this year? Well, there were more vehicles than recent years. There were 9 T-34s, the old tank. There were a few T-80 tanks. There were also some armoured personnel carriers, a few infantry fighting vehicle. There were the Tigers, the new Tiger, a sort of, Russia Humvee type equivalent, a wheeled armoured vehicle. There was the usual Yars 24, the nuclear missile carrying the big old launcher. There were also more people on parade than in recent years, but when you actually dig a bit deeper, there were a lot of delegations from China, Egypt, Vietnam, other countries. Okay, so there weren't thousands of Russian troops lined up. The parade was bolstered by all these other delegations, which clearly had nothing to do with the Second World War. So this is not about commemorating and respecting the veterans of the past. This was all about the here and now. As I say, North Korean generals were there, but no marching soldiers. There were very few veterans, partly because the old boys are getting on nowadays, but also that wasn't the focus. So in the past, we've seen a group, small number, half a dozen-ish, but around Putin in the stands. I think we saw one, didn't we? One nearby. So it's not the veterans. It's not about looking at the past. It's not about commemorating and respecting. It's all about him. Interestingly, there was no March of the Immortal Regiment. So what was that? It's one of the most recognisable events from the past, from these parades. The Immortal Regiment March is attendees proceed through Red Square holding portraits of their Second World War veteran relatives. Now, that was scrapped in 2023 and 24, and it was speculated that this was because of Kremlin concerns that people might wish to hold up pictures of their relatives killed in Ukraine. And what Putin absolutely does not want to do, he does not want to draw attention to the number of people killed in Ukraine or to have any show of dissent from the families. So we didn't see that. We didn't see that again this year. And as far as the kit, now I say there were more vehicles, but what did we see on the vehicles? Well, we saw a lot of drones, and we saw, because they didn't have a stencil on the side, I couldn't tell if it was the Iranian Shahed or the Russian-made Garand. So Russia has been building to an Iranian blueprint, building the same drones and calling them Garand 2 and Garand 3, slightly different in role, slightly different in speed and distance and all that kind of jazz, which I can't remember right now, to be perfectly honest. I think the 3 goes further and goes faster, but I can't actually remember. But the point is that they've got all this kit supposedly showing off Russia's military might, but it's Iranian kit. For those that know what they're looking at, you are literally highlighting that you don't have the military might, such you've got to go elsewhere. So the display of wider political support was laid on in spades, something that Oksana is going to be able to comment on shortly. Key takeaway for me was, number one, the sort of borderline get a room lads courting of China. In his speech, Putin said Russia highly appreciates the contribution to the victory of resistance fighters, allied armies, he did mention that, and, quote, the courageous people of China. He said the complete defeat of the Nazis and Japan was achieved by the common efforts of those fighting. We will always remember how the opening of the second front brought victory closer. Now, that last comment about the second front has not gone down well in Taiwan. Taiwan's government in the last couple of hours has criticised Russia and China for, as they say, distorting Second World War history, saying that the Chinese Communist forces made no substantial contribution to fighting Japan and instead took the opportunity to expand their own forces. Taiwan's Mainland Affairs Council released a statement in the last couple of hours saying it was the Republic of China government and people, i.e. those who were forced by Mao's communists in 1949 to withdraw to Taiwan. It was the Republic of China government who fought and ultimately won. In this statement, Taiwan's Mainland Affairs Council said the Chinese communists only took the opportunity to expand and consolidate their forces and made no substantial contribution to the war of resistance, let alone leading the war of resistance. So an attempt to rewrite history, but more so an attempt to get his arms firmly around Xi Jinping. The second thing for me, the big takeaway, albeit a small country, but the presence of Robert Fico, Prime Minister of Slovakia, had been warned by Kaja Kallas and others in advance that there would be consequences from the EU, not only with his attendance, but like I say, he was actually prominent after the parade happened on Red Square, which is the eastern side of the fortress of the Kremlin. Then all the delegations walked around the corner to the western side where there's the tomb of the unknown soldier, a flame that's been burning constantly since 1945, and they lay wreaths there. And Robert Fico laid a wreath at that ceremony. And as I said on the commentary this morning, now, I would love to be in a world where Western leaders could go and lay a wreath there at the Victory Day when we celebrate and respect the people who 80 years ago fought and died for our freedom. But that's no longer what this event is, Francis, obviously. So if Fico releases a statement saying that that's what he was doing, it's a sham. I'm afraid, from my view, he shouldn't have been anywhere near it. And I now look to the EU. Be interesting to see. Their bluff has been called. Will the EU actually take action against Fico and against Slovakia for his prominent attendance in this parade and for laying a wreath? But as I say, Francis, if you want to catch up on that, it's on our YouTube now. It's about an hour and 45, and we're running a live blog as well. You'll be able to catch up on all the main events there.
Well, thanks very much, Dom, for talking us through that. I think what I found most striking, especially for a parade which Putin said would underscore the reality of the Second World War, as you say, was the presence of those troops from China, Vietnam, Kazakhstan and other nations. Countries, as you say, with little historical connection to the events of the 1940s. And that was underscored by Xi's presence. A pretty stark rebuke, really, to the strategy believed to be favoured by the White House of driving a wedge between China and Russia. Doesn't seem to be working out so well, does it, guys? But anyway, the politics of Putin embracing a North Korean general, another pretty vivid moment, I think was quite interesting. North Korean troops didn't march in the parade, as you say, but its generals were present and they were seated in the front row. Many are saying that this decision for them not to take part but to be there was an attempt to avoid embarrassing foreign guests, given the fact that, lest we forget, North Korea remains under UN Security Council sanctions. I mean, it is pretty extraordinary. There are still certain boundaries, but they are slowly fading. And as I say, Putin did actually embrace the North Korean general. Now, if you want to learn more about the history of past Victory Day parades, today's inaugural Ukraine the Latest newsletter, written by Dom and myself, looks in more detail at past events, including the first one, which saw Stalin's Marshal Zhukov arriving on a white stallion and how it's evolved over the years. And we also answer recent questions sent by you. We'll have a link to that in the show notes, totally free for subscribers and non-subscribers alike. Now, just you were saying, Dom, interestingly, the Kremlin began disabling mobile internet access. It wasn't just in Moscow. It went as far east as Siberia, Yekaterinburg in the Urals as well, and several cities in the Volga. So clearly they were worried about security concerns, if not on the capital, then places elsewhere too. And just one final story on this before I bring in Oksana. Russian authorities in Ivangorod, that border town in the northwest of the country, broadcasted the parade across the river to neighbouring Estonia. There was a giant screen installed facing the Estonian town of Narva. We've spoken about it many times, complete with powerful loudspeakers aimed at the border, something that was rather gleefully gloated about in Russian propaganda this morning. But Narva didn't take it lying down, and the local museum responded by mounting a huge banner showing Putin side by side with Hitler, bearing the caption, "Putler, war criminal." Now, somehow I don't think that is going to make the headlines in Russia. But anyway, let's go then to friend of the podcast, Oksana of University College London. Welcome back. Always a pleasure. You were commenting on that parade this morning with Dom, as you were saying, and what jumped out at you? I mean, a pretty unusual one by the standards of what we were expecting, perhaps.
Thanks, Francis. Well, Victory Day around for allies in other countries usually has a more somber tone, very much about the people, not the bombs and the bullets, a respect to the memory of those who gave their lives to defeat fascism. But what I saw was the show was all about fascism on display, not only rewriting history, but making the focus about the heroic efforts of those Russian soldiers, their allies, and the weaponry, what I thought looked like a death parade in my view. All of those aspects really, I think, was difficult, I think, for many Ukrainians who were watching. I think it made a lot of people feel like their stomachs were sick about seeing those drones that they hear, that they react to, that they have to go and disrupt their daily classes to go into bomb shelters. That's what they're looking at. So stark reminder of, I think, just the tone, but also who was there in terms of that. Again, you mentioned the global South, but the rewriting of history, the direct linkage to Ukraine now. 8 million Ukrainians died fighting in World War II. And that sacrifice is being perverted into a new war against the Ukrainians now. And the typical Soviet strategy of the time was to take minority groups, Ukrainians amongst them, and others, Baltic states, etc. I mean, anyone with relatives from that area will be very familiar with this, that they were the frontline soldiers. They were put into that meat grinder first. And actually, that's strategic. It's a policy of domestic ethnic cleansing. And we also see that Russian soldiers were more protected and used in safer ways. Just like today, we see the inexperienced North Koreans facing the brunt of it, some of the people that they have recruited from the stands as well. So that's history repeating itself as well. Another thing that popped out for me was President of Brazil, Lula, actually being warmly embraced by Putin. And in theory, of course, the president of Brazil is anti-imperialistic, a democratically elected leader. So hugging someone who is the antithesis of all of these ideals, again, hypocrisy on full display. I think also seeing the growing coalition of countries that have been present in this year's parade is cause for concern. We saw Tajikistan also represented. When I was last there, you could really still see the influence of Russia on the ground and amongst the people. So they do have that stronghold there. And for me, it raise the issue that we cannot give up on these areas and territories, even if they are showing up for the victory parade, that we do have instruments like the Commonwealth and like the United Nations, which on this podcast I have heavily criticized, but it is a way to reach them. And we should be at least attempting to manage those bridges and to make use of those instruments. However, I think it's going to become much more challenging given the fact that one of the soft power diplomatic tools used by the U.S. under JFK. That's why USAID was started in the first place. And now all of those cuts to PEPFAR, USAID, the largest philanthropic organizations, means there's even less ability for soft power to be exerted in some of the countries in the global south that will be most harmed by this. The flagship HIV/AIDS program started under Bush 2003, saved 25 million lives since its inception. And now it's predicted that in coming years, we'll see 6 million deaths associated with HIV/AIDS. And amongst those deaths will be in the countries that we saw represented in the parade today. So with that health lens as well, we can see that global health has its own diplomatic avenues.
Well, just on that subject, Oksana, of course, healthcare is your primary subject of expertise. And I just wanted to ask, we were talking about this yesterday on the podcast, the impact of Russian weapons on healthcare facilities. Could you just perhaps speak a little bit more about that for us?
Yes, so it's not just on healthcare facilities, it's also on personnel. So it's all of it. And that number is over 2,300. And that means that there's going to be associated costs in rebuilding it and trying to also replace the centers. But we've also in Ukraine had significant loss of healthcare workers through internal displacement, through leaving the country. And so there's a healthcare workforce shortage, as well as having to rebuild, and the whole population as a result having to suffer. The estimated costs just within the health sector alone is over $20 billion in order to address the devastation caused by the Russians. So there's that aspect. And then, of course, this invasion has cost Ukraine on every level. Within the healthcare sector, we also have disruption in education. We have mental health crisis. Dom and I were on a panel earlier this week at UCL. We've partnered with Ukrainian Action. It's a fantastic charity that is supporting veterans, because the entire, not just the veteran population, but the country at large, every day is sustaining attacks. And over the long term, we see that over 2/3 of soldiers are affected by PTSD, but without having the resources available because of these targeted attacks on healthcare, it becomes even more difficult to treat them and the civilian population as well.
Well, thank you very much, Oksana, for your reflections there. There are a few military and political updates to run through on the top of what we've already discussed. So just starting with the military sphere, Ukrainian troops made further attempts to breach the Russian border in the Kursk and Belgorod regions, Interfax report this morning, citing the Russian Defense Ministry. Contrary to the so-called truce in place, there are reports of Russian shelling in Nicholls. That's near Dnipropetrovsk, if I remember correctly, where another pensioner was injured. Russian drones have also been reported in Kherson in the past few hours. Perhaps the most important military story of the day, though, is an investigation by Reuters into a major factory expansion in remote Siberia to ramp up production of a powerful explosive used in artillery shells and other munitions. Now, we mentioned North Korea earlier on, and of course far more significant than the troops they gave have been the huge quantities of shells that they have donated. Now, Reuters say the additional explosive anticipated from this project could help increase Moscow's firepower significantly at a time when Ukraine and its Western allies have been stepping up production of ordnance needed to thwart Russian advances. Now, the factory is located 3,000 kilometres east of Moscow. That's out of range of most Ukrainian attack drones, which have, of course, been targeting the Russian arms industry, including this week, as Moscow was prioritising its air defences. The new facility was expected to produce 6,000 metric tons of high explosive annually. Another rebuke to those who think that Putin is pursuing a ceasefire. Now, another interesting story is that the Security Service of Ukraine says it's dismantled a Hungarian military intelligence network operating in the Carpathian Mountains, part of Ukraine that has a sizable ethnic Hungarian minority, and Kyiv has long accused Budapest of undermining its sovereignty through political interference and dual citizenship schemes there. The SBU says they detained 2 agents accused of espionage against the Ukrainian state and claim it's the first time Ukrainian authorities have exposed a Hungarian military intelligence network conducting activities harmful to their country. Now, our friends at the Kyiv Independent say the group's objectives reportedly included gathering intelligence on military defences, identifying vulnerabilities in air defence systems, and assessing local residents' social political views, particularly scenarios of public reaction if Hungarian troops entered the region. Very striking, that. Investigators identified their supervisor as a Hungarian military intelligence officer whose identity had already been established by the agency. We're going to be looking more closely at Hungary again soon, as there have been some interesting developments in the political realm there recently. But let's turn to politics now, just briefly. As a rebuke to Putin's parade, EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas and other European foreign policy ministers are in Lviv today in an expression of solidarity with Ukraine, and also to endorse, interestingly, the creation of a special tribunal to try Russia's top leadership over the invasion. That was only announced just before we went on air, so I'll be looking into that in a little bit more detail soon. The British Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, is there, hot on the heels of an announcement of a new package of sanctions to target the Shadow Fleet carrying Russian oil. According to the Foreign Office, sanctions have crippled 200 such ships, almost half of Putin's entire fleet, although, of course, there are nuances there, as we've discussed several times previously. You'll hear the latest acts of resistance in the occupied territories later in the episode. But just to end, in occupied Melitopol, Russians have unveiled a monument to Stalin today, a clear symbol of the kind of state Russia has become, as we were speaking about earlier on, restoring the legacy of a man who is held responsible for killing hundreds of thousands of Russians and millions of Ukrainians because of the Holodomor in the 1930s. For decades, he was a loathed figure even in the Soviet Union, by his successors, no less, most notably Khrushchev. But his reputation has now been officially restored by Putin. And for the last few years, we've seen statues popping up everywhere of a man responsible for the deaths of so many. But that's enough from me in terms of the updates. Let's go to our next guest now, former Member of Parliament in Ukraine, Lesia Orobets, who's in the studio with us. She is the leader of the Sky Shield Initiative, that European-led air protection zone proposal that's pushing for combat air patrols over uncontested areas of Ukraine. We'll get to that very shortly. But first of all, I have to ask you for your reaction to the spectacle we've seen in Red Square this morning, and indeed the revival of Stalin's image.
Thank you so much for having me here. There's a huge division between nations who on the Remembrance Day say something like never again versus the states that say можем повторить, which is in Russian, we can repeat. There's a huge difference between that approach and that describes everything. As Ukrainians, as Oksana mentioned, paid the highest price possible, losing over 8 million civilians and soldiers in that war, we do remember the price paid. And Stalin, as the leader of the Soviet Union then, we should remind you the history a little bit more. Soviet Union started their participation in the Second World War on Nazi side, and then they shifted side not because they realized the falseness of their ideology, but because Germany attacked. And that's the only reason they ended up in the right side of the history and now manifesting their belonging to the Victory Day. However, I can assure you that something that happened on the Red Square this day could be the start of the formalization of the axis of evil, those who were willing to participate in the next ambition of Putin to replay the Stalin's ambition to control Europe by occupying eastern part of Europe and imposing its political influence by all means and odds to the extent of Russian agents, Russian paid politicians, Russian paid media, and any other tricks they can pull out of their pocket. So while one nations remember that this is the end of the Holocaust Day, we can also remember that, unfortunately, events like Bucha and other war crimes made us Ukrainians feel probably very close to the same as Jews in the Second World War, being extinct just because of being Ukrainians. So yes, our demand for the special tribunal for Russian leadership is something that was our top priority since the early days of our advocacy in 2022. Our Nobel Prize award put that clear that we need that tribunal. Sooner or later that should happen, because as the Second World War was able to conquer the Nazi regime, unfortunately they failed to conquer another evil, which is the communist regime and its aftermath, Putin's Russia. So how about we end this story there with the tribunal as it should have been decades ago?
Are you optimistic that Putin and his acolytes will ever see justice in the form of a special tribunal and will ever, as it were, face a court or a jury?
Oh, they have good doctors, so I presume they would survive to that.
Let's turn then to the Sky Shield initiative. It's something that we've spoken about several times on the podcast. Indeed, when the initiative was first put forward, I think we had Dr. Jade McGlynn speaking about it in detail, who I'm sure you know very well. Where are we with it? And perhaps you could just start by summarising what you're proposing and how things have evolved over the last few months.
I could only remind you that in the beginning of the full-scale war, we were all advocating for the closed Ukrainian sky. However, it never happened because of the position of Biden's administration being afraid of any escalation happening, as the possible conflict between Western jets and Russian jets could lead to that escalation. However, the Sky Shield is something different. What we would kindly invite the Western aviation to take responsibility of patrolling the western part of Ukraine, including big Odessa seaports, to be able to cover our most critical energy infrastructure to help our economy to stay away from blackouts, which potentially could harm our economy, as we've already lost over the half of our power generation. And I could only remind you that would help us to keep standing, as we pay our army with our taxes, so we need to collect them. And we would very much want to protect this big Odessa seaports, as this is crucial for our export economy also because of that. But the bigger role of the Sky Shield is definitely protecting this humanitarian civic population and our cities, as while negotiations are going on, we are under huge missile blackmail on the Russian side. They are bombing our cities as we speak every time with no ceasefire at all, or even on the contrary. We know for sure that they increase their production of missiles and drones. And Dominic previously mentioned the Shaheds. I can assure you that what they've showed on that parade is that they can take the Iranian or North Korean technology, they can take Shahed, improve it, test it on Ukrainian ground, and make it their weapon of terrorism over any capital, not just Kyiv. This is a possibility for them to increase the threat to any population of any country they try to damage. But also they took North Korean ballistic missile, which was the horrible quality one. They were falling apart in the air, but in months with their Russian help, engineering, sea machines, and feedback from battlefield, it turned out to be a very good weapon. So my point is that this axis of evil is already highly cooperative, while we are still discussing what kind of a security guarantees we can put in the air. So getting back to the Sky Shield, I strongly believe that it's not only in Ukrainian interest to save our population from this huge terrorism, but also it is the way to save the peace process. Because if you are negotiating with a terrorist state, last thing you need is to have 30 million hostages under the bombing. And also, if we would find a political will to establish such a security guarantee as Sky Shield, as wings in the air, as Prime Minister Starmer described, we would be sure that the pilots and commanders and logistics fully trained to any challenges that our capitals, European and British capital, could face in the nearest future. This is our way to make Europe a safer place.
Well, you mentioned the political will there. Of course, the Coalition of the Willing is said to be considering some form of Sky Shield. And I wanted to ask whether these proposals, I'm sure more about them perhaps than we do, how similar they are to yours. Do they go far enough, or is this really needing an even more robust approach than the sense that we're getting out of those European powers at the moment?
We are receiving the political signals that there is an appetite for establishing some security guarantees like Sky Shield for Ukraine, as both Trump's administration and others are expecting Europe to come up with a sufficient plan. So yes, we do receive the signals, and yes, we know that some military planning is going on, while negotiations could end up in anything. They could end up in ceasefire. They could end up nowhere. We still have to find our way out of this war, securing Ukrainians, civilians and industry and economy, and meanwhile being much better prepared economically wise and military wise as Europe as a whole.
Thanks, Lesia. I have a couple of specific questions, if I may, about Sky Shield. Now, people have asked us, what's the difference between that and a no-fly zone? And to my understanding, well, a no-fly zone is actually a very aggressive act, because one of the very first things you have to do in a no-fly zone is start knocking out air defence radars and missile launching sites and what have you on the ground. So a no-fly zone isn't just stooging around in the sky saying you'll shoot down anything that comes your way. It almost by necessity doesn't always have to start with stuff blowing up on the ground, but it generally does. So a no-fly zone, incredibly aggressive action. And so Sky Shield is a different, I wouldn't say a watered down version of it, it solves a different problem. The plan I saw for Sky Shield was to have about 120 non-US NATO jets patrolling the skies based outside of Ukraine. So they would not be on the ground in Ukraine. They would launch from the bordering nations, probably tank over, as in refuel, over Western Ukraine, and then do the racetrack circuit there. So there'd be no boots on the ground, no NATO boots on the ground, no aircraft on the ground, but they would be in the skies over Western Ukraine. And they would be there to shoot down any ballistic missiles, drones and what have you that were being fired into Ukraine, like US, Britain, France and others did in support of Israel. So that they would be there to shoot stuff down that's in the air, not attack things that were on the ground. That was my understanding of it. So where are we with that idea? It is a step ahead of where we are right now, clearly, but it is by no means as aggressive as a no-fly zone, which is one of the reasons why it was doing the rounds and being suggested. How close are we to people actually stepping up and saying, we can supply this number of jets, we can do that, etc., etc.? Because it's all gone very quiet on the numbers.
Dominic, thank you, first of all, for describing this idea so thoroughly. I couldn't have done it better. And yes, you're quite right. There's a big difference between closing the sky, which is an aggressive action, versus the Sky Shield, which is just patrolling and shooting down the cruise missiles or attacking drones over the significant objects. There's a huge difference in terms of escalation risk, which we would want to play down to the minimum. Secondly, answering your question, we do know that negotiations are going on right now. And we are all waiting what would come from the Russian side. What are their appetites to? Are they actually eager to finish the war on some terms? Or they're just playing Trump's ambition to end it, and Putin gets what he wanted to get out of these negotiations, meaning breaking his isolation, and that's it. So probably all experts I asked would summarize the perspectives of those negotiations as not quite optimistic. So we would have to be prepared for Plan B, which could be the Sky Shield and other security guarantees while peace negotiations do or do not continue.
Thank you. So there's a thought that Sky Shield could be implemented ahead of any ceasefire. And now clearly that's putting men and women in harm's way without a ceasefire. So, yeah, a big political statement. I don't deny that. Don't seek to downplay it at all. But you're suggesting Sky Shield is not contingent upon there being a ceasefire. And in the, I don't want to say coalition, but in the group of people who are having these discussions about Sky Shield, who's leading the debate?
It's actually Britain who is in front of any such coalition. And one of the reasons why is that probably, that's only my good guess, but we do have the best response within British establishment, probably because we share the common experience during the Second World War. We are also sitting under bombing and do not giving up. So probably that, and also the understanding of the responsibility and having a further horizon of planning, understanding that if we do manage to stop Russia here on the Ukrainian borders, we wouldn't have then to pay the higher price stopping it somewhere else in Europe. So probably that is the high motive for British establishment to have a leading role in that.
And sorry, if I may just press you on that first point, is Sky Shield contingent upon a ceasefire? We could announce Sky Shield now, today. Or does it have to wait for some form of ceasefire, temporary or long term, before the member states having these discussions say, right, let's go for it?
That's a very good question. We do know that there's a huge public support in many countries, including Britain and France, for establishing a ceasefire or any that kind of security guarantees to ensure the peace process. However, we are still looking for a political will to make it happen. Because if you would ask me if it's military possible, yes, many former heads of air forces in Europe confirmed it by signing the Sky Shield plan. So we are only looking for a political will on whatever we are ready to do.
Thank you very much for your thoughts on that. I've got one final question, if I may. You speaking about the British political approach to this, and you talk about the resonances of the Blitz, of course. You've been at one of the major defence conferences taking place this week. I just wonder, what's your sense of the mood How are people feeling at the moment about the war, about Britain's role, about the position of Europe, and indeed the feeling around the United States?
I do travel a lot in European capitals these days, advocating for Sky Shield and other initiatives, and I can assure you that British officers, British establishment are much better in realizing the threat that's coming rather than anyone in any other capital. That's on the good side, meaning that the population has the idea what is going on and does support politicians who have that idea, which I strongly applaud because, as I said, the price for preventing is smaller than for curing, which COVID told us. On the other hand, we are still in the planning process, to be fair, and unfortunately, Russians are much quicker in establishing all those industrial and military ties, as the parade on the Red Square showed, and imposing their political influence even on EU members to come get there. Unfortunately, this is an uneven competition, and we have to be much more united to deter Russia these days.
And what are people saying about America? Do they think that America is going to pull out of Europe in the short to medium term, or at least pull out of support for Ukraine in this war?
Oh, they're not saying. They are actually preparing for that scenario as quickly as they can. However, I can only assure you that Putin is not only celebrating the victory, which he had nothing to do with as he wasn't even born then, but also he's trying to replay the result of a Cold War. He already somehow got the result where Europe and America are divided, first time since the beginning of the Cold War. And second, with just few speeches, they undermined the effectiveness of NATO as the security guarantor. So 2 out of 3 of a Cold War are already underplayed by Putin. What comes next? So this is the time we are living in, and I'm happy to inform the British public on where we're standing and what kind of challenges we are facing.
Well, thank you very much for your reflections on that. We'll come back to you for your final thoughts in a moment. Let's turn to Illia Riepin now, Dr. Jade McGlynn's researcher, for the latest updates on resistance in the occupied territories. Illia, over to you.
Between 25th of April and 8th of May, Ukrainian resistance groups carried out at least 14 confirmed actions in occupied Ukrainian territories and inside Russia. A major trend during this period was targeted assassination and attacks on Russian military figures and infrastructure. For instance, in Balashikha, near Moscow, a car bomb killed Russian General Yaroslav Moskalik. In Bryansk, that is the west part of Russia, near the Belarus border, a similar explosion killed a top engineer responsible for Russian electronic warfare systems. And in Veliki Kopani, it's a part of occupied Kherson region, a drone struck a local occupation official. Also, several attacks targeted logistics and communication systems. In Moscow, for example, resistance fighters damaged a railway infrastructure near the Malenkovska station and Yauza to the north of the city center. In Stanitsa Luhanska, it's east part of Ukraine, also part of occupied Luhansk region, a transformer used by Russian military for electronic warfare also was destroyed. In Saratov and the Moscow region, similar power stations and communications hubs were taken out of service, affecting several military units. Resistance fighters also carried out symbolic and non-violent actions. In Donetsk, activists organized a boycott of a state-organized cleanup day meant to honor Russian war criminals buried at a local cemetery. In occupied Berdyansk, which is a south part of Ukraine, a pair of teenagers were filmed publicly playing a protest song for full volume. The song included provocative lyrics such as "I don't want to join Yunarmia" and "I'll blow up the military enlistment office." By the way, Yunarmia is a short for Youth Army. It's a Russian state-sponsored military patriotic organization created in 2016 with the support of Russian Ministry of Defense. It targets children and teenagers aged from 8 to 18. In short, UNARME is a tool for state propaganda and early militarization. Actually, we don't know what happened to teenagers after this video was shared.
Thanks, Illia. So those are an overview of the major activities we've seen. Can you take us through the others you've recorded chronologically, please?
On April 25th in Simferopol, Crimea, the guerrilla group set fire to a bus used by Russian forces targeting occupier transport. That same day, in Moscow, the Mariupol resistance sabotaged the part of railway infrastructure aiming to disrupt military logistics. Also, on April 25th, two high-profile assassinations occurred deep inside Russia. In Bryansk, that's on the west part of Russia, there was eliminated a Russian electronic warfare engineer named Yevgen Rutikov, who worked on military systems. In Balashikha, near Moscow, partisans carried out the assassination of Russian General Yaroslav Moskalik. He was a high-ranking officer in the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation. Moskalik was also involved in the international military negotiations, including his participation in Normandy format talks in 2015. But at the time of his death, he served as the deputy chief of the main operational directorate of the General Staff, a position that placed him near to the core of Russian military planning and strategic operations. On April 26, in Stanitsa Luhanska, its east part of Ukraine, the Atesh group blew up a transformer on the railway, possibly affecting power and transport coordination. Then, on April 28, a fuel depot was set on fire in Novorossiysk, a region where the Russian Navy is now based since Black Sea Fleet chased out of Crimea. A day later, April 29, saw two attacks. In Mariupol, east part of temporarily occupied territories, a former school building used by Russian militaries was set ablaze by the Mariupol resistance. In Zaporizhia Oblast, south region of occupied territories, a car bomb exploded, targeting occupiers' vehicles. The first of two similar actions by the Srok group. If you remember, last time we introduced this new and young resistance movement on occupied territories, the Srok group. On April 30, in Zabaikalsky Krai, it's very deep inside Russia, the partisans started a fire at a Russian military storage area. Then, on 1st of May, in Veliki Kopani, was wounded a local collaborator, Mykola Novizhny. He was the head of an occupied village in Kherson region. On the 2nd May, the Srok carried out another vehicle bombing in Zaporizhia Oblast, in Zaporizhia region, making their second such operation in 4 days. On the 5th of May, in Saratov, the Atesh group disabled a power hub used to fuel and defend military base. And finally, today, on the 8th of May, Atesh struck again in Mytishi, its Moscow region, by sabotaging communications equipment near the Russian military base. That is all from my side. Thank you, Francis.
The troubles in Northern Ireland are raging. Civilians find themselves caught in the crosshairs.
My father was covered in blood.
Behind the violence, there's a sinister secret.
He is probably the most high-profile British agent that we know of to date.
A covert unit of the British Army is connected to a string of murders.
If you could recruit a terrorist, that's the cream on the cake.
And the fight for justice continues.
There wasn't just one agent. Most of them were agents.
The latest podcast from The Telegraph. I'm Cara McGugan, and this is Bed of Lies. Search Bed of Lies wherever you're listening to this.
Oksana, you've been listening to all of this. I wonder, where do you want to leave our listeners today as we enter final thoughts?
Well, one of the things that Dom and I talked about earlier was how Trump is likely jealous of the big parade today, and he would like to have something bigger and grander and better because he likes signs of strength. But maybe this could be the thing that turns him around to recognize the enemies of the West because they were all there. And I think that we should not give up on the countries within the global South, that diplomatic avenues have not yet been exhausted. We need to use incentives and disincentives, of which secondary sanctions could be part of the package. And my own global health community, I don't think has done enough to support Ukraine. And now with the big gap in terms of U.S. almost imploding its own global health arm as a means of diplomacy, other countries, Europe, the UK, are going to have to fill that gap. Which leads me to my final point. Sorry, Francis. The healthcare sector is bleeding, and we know due to the existential threat of Russia, the health sector alone cannot support the mental health needs of veterans, of which are significant, and the civilian population. So my request to all listeners today is to check out Ukrainian Action, and if they can, to make a donation. Any amount helps. Collective effort can drive change. And so please be a change maker today. Thank you.
Oksana, always a pleasure to have you on. Dom, let's go to you next for your final thoughts.
Thanks, Francis. Couple near and far, if I may. The near, there's been a new German weapons package announced in support of Ukraine. They're going to send 66 MRAPs, that's mine-resistant armoured protected vehicles, and other mine clearance vehicles. They're going to send air defence systems and ammunition, including Patriots, as in Patriot missiles. I don't think they're sending the launchers, but they're also sending thousands of artillery rounds, hundreds of drones. So a good package there from Germany. And a bit sort of slower burn, but it all adds up. The British government has said it's going to sanction up to 100 oil tankers that form the core of Putin's shadow fleet. The government here says that they are responsible for carrying more than $24 billion worth of cargo since the start of 2024. Prime Minister Keir Starmer said the threat from Russia to our national security cannot be underestimated. That's why we will do everything in our power to destroy his shadow fleet operation. When did you last hear a Prime Minister use the word destroy?
Good point. Good question.
Destroy his shadow fleet operation, starve his war machine of oil revenues, and protect the subsea infrastructure that we rely on for our everyday lives. Interesting comment. I mean, slow burn, the shadow fleet, but interesting comment from the Prime Minister.
Well, thanks very much, Dom, for that. And Lesia, as our guest today, come a long way. Where would you like to leave our listeners?
The worst thing that could happen to our generation unfortunately happened. That's the war. And we are definitely making everything that the next war, if happening, wouldn't catch us off guard. And this is a lesson learned from Ukrainian side that we share. And much can be done in improving our capacities and capabilities, our industry, us giving you the lesson how to resist and how to make sure that your army and your civilians are up to the challenge, whatever comes next. And I'm thankful to the Telegraph for informing the population on the threats of the hybrid war, because the more honest you are with your population, actually saying what happened, not just, oopsie, it was set on fire, but actually who is behind it, that the Russian agents somehow destabilized, let's say, attacked the civilian hospitals or did something with your airports or otherwise destabilized the situation, that has names and that has someone to blame for. So while you inform your public about the real situation, you make yourself stronger and more open to what's coming and more supportive to your politicians that lead you the right way. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for having me here.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.